We've been digging around in our virtual mailbag this week and we've had loads of great questions, but actually there is one story that has been developing around immigration that we really wanted to focus on. So we're just going to do one question on that theme so that we have time to talk about it all. Rachel, which question have we picked?
Okay, so I travelled far and wide to get this question, which has come from Josh in Australia, although I'm sure plenty of people in this country are thinking about this issue too. Josh asks, do you think the replacement of Suella Braverman with James Cleverly as Home Secretary will help reduce the backlog of asylum claims?
So this is a good question. I mean, it's a far too sensible question for the reality that we're living in at the moment, I think, because reducing the backlog, as our questioner mentions, would probably do more to ease the situation of paying £7 million a day or whatever we're paying for asylum seekers in hotels around the country, and help clear that backlog and also help send the people who don't have legitimate claims back to their own countries. So that's not happening. The Prime Minister has committed to clearing the backlog, but that's of 91,000 so far legacy asylum decisions. So those are applications that have been waiting for an initial decision since last June. That's just 52% of the actual overall backlog. So it's huge, the number of decisions they have to get through. And the Home Office has hired new caseworkers, like hundreds of new caseworkers in the past year or so to tackle this. But I think we spoke about this, Freddie, on a previous podcast. Robert Jenrick, who was the immigration minister until recently, and we'll come on to him later, he actually as much as admitted in an interview that processing claims quickly would perhaps incentivise more people to come. So there's always been that slight reticence about actually clearing this backlog properly.
Yeah, though we must say that the legacy backlog has gone down. Yeah. It's just that new people coming into the system has made sure that the total number of asylum seekers has stayed static. Yeah. So they have made some effort to do so, and as you say, they have hired people in the Home Office, but it's worth saying that the capacity to do so beforehand was abysmal. Yeah. So they're just trying to catch up with the past. I mean, they're not doing a great job of it, but they definitely made some progress with the legacy claims.
But that's an interesting point, that what Jenrick said, that processing claims promptly might encourage more people to come here. You could look at it the other way. If you knew that you didn't have a legitimate claim to be here and you would be quickly processed and then sent back, which is what happens when claims get rejected, you might not want to risk it. Whereas if you know that, there's going to be a couple of years of back and forth,
in which you can go into the black economy and
disappear, or
work,
in which time anything can happen, really, then that's slightly different.
Yeah, absolutely. And our questioner then asks whether or not, this backlog will come down faster under Cleverly than Braverman. But we know that Cleverly's focus as Home Secretary so far, and I know he hasn't been in the job that long, he's actually been preoccupied with other things, hasn't he? So we'll go through those. First of all, there's been a bunch of changes to legal migration announced this week. Rachel, can you take us through those changes?
Yes. So it's quite interesting that for the last kind of couple of years, whenever the topic of immigration in general has come up, the Conservative reflex has been to talk about stopping the boats, Rwanda illegal migration. And that kind of all changed a couple of weeks ago when we had the new migration figures, which showed that legal migration in 2022 was up to 745,000, which is a record, and it was 620,000 for 2023. And keep in mind that the Conservative policy is to get migration back into the tens of thousands. So what they've announced to tackle legal migration, so people who are in the country or coming to the country because the Home Office has granted them visas, the headline one was changing the minimum salary needed for skilled overseas workers from £26,000 to £38,700. That doesn't apply to the health and social care sector. So there is still an exemption, which is you have to earn this much, but not if you're coming to work in our NHS or social care.
Yeah, or teachers or anyone else on national pay scales like that.
The teachers one, they had to clarify that later because people went, hang on, teachers are on national pay scales. And they were like, oh yeah, not that either. So other skilled work.
So a lot of public sector workers are exempt.
Yes. Then there's a ban on bringing family dependents to the UK, which applies to
care workers,
which has also been something that the care sector has really talked about. And hang on, we want people to come here, but we don't want them to bring their children or families. And companies being able to pay workers 20% less than the going rate for jobs on the shortage application list, which Labour has said that they would do as well. That's been one of their policies. increased the annual charge foreign workers pay to use the NHS from £624 to £1,035, keeping in mind that a lot of these migrant workers are working in the NHS, and raised the minimum income for family visas from £18,600 to £38,700, basically doubling it and making it, that threshold is now higher than the median wage in the UK, which that has got quite a lot of attention as well, because it means that if you are British and you want to marry somebody from another country, you now have to be earning more than 73% of the population to be able to do that. And there was a lot of back and forth as to whether that was the amount that a couple would have to earn together, or a single person is like this, the British person would have to be earning that. And then there was confusion over whether this would apply to foreign spouses currently in the UK. And bizarrely, the Home Office says, yes, it would. So the Home Office current position is if you are legally married to someone from a different country and they came here legally on a spousal visa, according to the old rules, but you're not earning £38,000, they have to go back to their home country, which I don't think will actually happen in practice, but kind of shows that I'm not sure this was thought through to quite the degree that you would hope.
Well, something I thought that showed how rushed and panicked these changes were was because of the exemptions for those health and care workers that you mentioned and the teachers and things who the raised minimum salary threshold doesn't apply to. It basically means that these spousal and family visa changes are more draconian for Brits than they are for migrants. So if you come over as a worker in the NHS and you don't earn $38,700, you can bring your spouse over if you earn above the former threshold.
But if you're British,
you're British, you can't, even if you have that same job in the NHS. So actually, I think some of these things really haven't been thought through, which goes to show how rushed they were.
It just speaks to the absolute panic that went through the Conservative Party and Westminster in general. I think when those figures were released, they're extremely high. So people and the government said we have to do something immediately, both to address the concerns with the MPs and also to not let it get out of hand as a political issue. I mean, they're grappling with the fact that they've promised for years and years and years to solve this problem and haven't. So Rishi Sunak's basically saying, or betting the house on the fact that he's going to grasp immigration as an issue, and that's why we've got such a swift and you might say draconian response.
And I think they will get the numbers down, won't they? Because a lot of these migrants in the figures that you quoted, Rachel, were through Ukraine refugee scheme, Hong Kong refugee scheme, and the sort of build-up of international students over COVID, which, that should calm down by the next set of figures as well. So I think they will oversee a drop in legal migration figures. So they'll probably use these kind of changes that they've introduced to kind of point to those. Yeah, but if
it's 700,000 at the moment, and they're saying it's going to reduce that by 300,000, you're still left with 400,000, right? Yeah. Which is still way above where they've said they want it to be.
I just want to call you out on something that you said, which is you called it a problem. And obviously it is a problem for the Conservative Party, and it is a challenge in terms of housing and public services and GP appointments and schools, very, very much so. And I'm not underestimating the scale of any of that. But with the exception of the Ukraine scheme and the Hong Kong scheme, which, as Anoosh said, are one-offs, the other migrants who are coming here are coming for shortage occupations to work in the healthcare sector or as international students, propping up British universities, which are heavily reliant on international students paying international fees. And you get a lot of Conservatives, you get Danny Kruger, Neil O'Brien, Nick Timothy sort of saying that that's not sustainable and that numbers of that level aren't sustainable. And obviously those numbers are very, very high, but they don't then say immediately, what are you going to do if you ban a whole load of international students and half your universities collapse, or if you ban foreign workers from coming to working in the NHS and the NHS waiting lists get even longer. And if you look individually at the breakdown of all of those areas, if you ask the public, should we have more foreign doctors and nurses to help bring down waiting lists? Generally, public are supportive. If you ask voters, do you think like this university should either close or, be allowed to double its fees for domestic students, they're not so keen on that either. If you say, do you want to raise taxes to be able to pay for the social care so we can pay higher wages, so we can get domestic workers to do that work, that's not very popular either. So yes, the migration figure is a problem, but solving it in a sort of dramatically reducing the numbers kind of way does itself come with a lot of other problems.
Yeah, naturally. I mean, it's the numbers that we're seeing at the moment are a symptom of all of the other problems that you just set out. I mean, why is it that we have to bring in so many social care workers from elsewhere? Well, in part, it's because social care workers are paid so poorly.
We don't fund the system properly.
We don't fund the system properly. There's so much exploitation. There's so much room for manoeuvre around the regulations within the care sector. You mentioned housing. Okay, well, if we have got a massive housing crisis, of course, you're going to exacerbate that if you're not building enough houses by bringing in more people, obviously. So it's a symptom of those problems completely. Yeah, so all you're saying, I think, is essentially that we have to deal with those problems at root.
Yeah, I'm saying that looking at the problem of high migration without looking at all of the problems that you would cause by reducing any of those numbers doesn't give you the full picture. And I think it's quite misleading when you get Conservatives who are absolutely outraged by the headline figure but aren't prepared to commit the funding or the structural policy changes in any of those areas that would naturally bring the number down.
Yeah.
I agree, and I would hope that if we do decrease the number of people coming in to go and work in the NHS or the care sector, for instance, you would see a rise in the wages of people who work in that sector.
Yeah, although Will Dunn, our colleague business editor, he interviewed the head of the Migration Advisory Committee, which is the body that advises the Home Office on this stuff, on shortage occupation lists, who to put on and things like that. And he actually said the evidence shows that migrants earn the same as Brits on average. So it's not necessarily...
Sure, on average, but not in those sectors where they can earn 20% less than the going
which
rate in the market,
they're going to get rid of. Yeah, but I do think, if you basically make it more attractive for migrants to come and work in the care sector, then I'm not sure that these provisions are going to bring the numbers down very significantly at all. With these exemptions that you have, I think it's quite likely that you're going to see quite similar numbers coming over, and actually probably relying more on the state, because they're not going to have their family members there to support them. So I do think they're sticking to their current economic model, which is a high migration model, even though some of these sound like quite dramatic changes.
Suella Braverman suggested that what we needed was a quota, a national quota on migration, and to have all the departments, so the business department, the health department, the education department, each assigned a certain number and working together to make sure that they don't, top that. The problem with that is that each individual department has issued this number of visas because it's in their interests to do so. So there is it's one of those things where the government's overall target is at odds with the targets and the needs of the individual departments.
Yeah. And something else Cleverly's been concentrating on in the second half of this week, he's had a busy week, is the Rwanda scheme, which is about a different part of migration altogether. It's about the people who try and come here through irregular routes rather than through the schemes that we've just been talking about. He signed a treaty with Rwanda, and then the government has published its emergency legislation, which is to try and see off legal challenges to its deportation scheme. Freddie, can you explain the treaty? So we've got the treaty, and then we've got the safety of Rwanda asylum and immigration.
Yeah, so essentially this is the government's response to the Supreme Court judgment, which ruled that the Rwanda scheme, as it currently stands, it goes against the law because there's a risk of non-refoulement, whereby some migrants in Rwanda might be sent to a country where they're persecuted. So they're trying to address it in two ways. First, you've got the treaty, whereby it's a legally binding agreement with Rwanda, which states that they are not allowed to send migrants who are sent there elsewhere, unless it's back to the UK. So that's one way in which they've dealt with that. And then the second part is this quite extraordinary bill, which was introduced to the House of Commons this week, which essentially says that we as a parliament, as one Tory MP put it to me, the highest court in the land, are asserting the fact that Rwanda is a safe country, regardless of what the facts or the courts may say. So in addition to that, they've essentially said that the courts are not able to rule that it's otherwise. Yep. So what they're trying to do is to shut down the chance of legal challenges. They have left open the opportunity for individual migrants to place individual challenges in the courts, which some Tory MPs are annoyed about. Others think it's just a normal right that you have in a liberal society, whereby someone can have a course of challenge in the courts as an individual. But this is quite stark how strongly they've rebutted something that would normally fall within the court's remit. That's essentially what this is. I mean, they've said we're going to, as a parliament, as as the sovereign institution in the UK, dictate how we see things to be, and the courts will have to fall under line with that. I mean, it doesn't mean necessarily, or it doesn't mean that people can't go to Strasbourg and they go to this ECHR there. So there's still an opportunity for legal challenges there. However, they have preempted that and basically said that ministers can decide whether or not they ignore those rulings. So, I mean, they've tried to address every single conception or possibility of challenge to these deportations and put it in the bill. So let's see whether it goes through Parliament, because I mean there's opposition from some MPs. Is it going to get through the Lords? So there's some questions there. But yeah, this is them trying to close down any opposition to the Rwanda scheme.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it seems to challenge both the rule of law, but also doesn't cancel out some ways of challenging the decisions in court. So it kind of hasn't pleased anyone in a way. You've got Suella Braverman saying it doesn't meet her tests. Robert Jenrick, the immigration minister, resigned quite spectacularly because James Cleverly was announcing these things in Parliament and he was nowhere to be seen, and there were rumours that he wasn't on board, and he's saying it didn't go far enough. So you've got those Tories. I mean, it's interesting because Robert Jenrick was not really seen as a minister on the right really until he seemed to be captured by the Home Office, or at least his own ambitions. But yeah, you've got those Tories on the right who feel that it doesn't go far enough, and then you've got the One Nation group, which I think originally welcomed the new measures, but are now a little bit more sceptical.
One of the reasons that they welcomed it a bit more is that particular group are feeling a bit more confident after the reshuffle, because they did quite well in the reshuffle, and they had said that they weren't going to support any bill that broke international law. Interestingly, Rwanda has also said that they won't be part of a deal that breaks international law, which is kind of hilarious that you've now got Rwanda telling Britain don't break international law. But it's a very, very narrow sort of Venn diagram that you can get the crossover of it being extreme enough for those on the right who don't want there to be any role for the courts or any chance of there being a role for the court at all, and then those in the One Nation group who don't want it to in any way break international or break the law essentially, and trying to have a system that simultaneously excludes the courts but doesn't exclude the courts too much. There's like a sliver of space in between, or at least Rishi Sunak was hoping that there was, but now today it looks like perhaps that space doesn't really exist in the way that he thought it did.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is why the statement from the Rwandan government is so interesting, because it essentially backs up Rishi Sunak's claim that they couldn't have gone any further without the Rwandan saying, we don't want any part of this.
Yeah. It's quite helpful for him, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it makes Robert Jenrick's position look unsustainable, because he's claiming we could have gone further and it's the only way the scheme can happen. And then you've got the Rwandan government saying, well, if you did go further, there wouldn't be any scheme to begin with in the first place.
We wouldn't have signed it. Yeah. I mean, and also it just, I mean, even if it passes, and there's a lot of questions about sort of how it will be changed, maybe in the Commons, but definitely by the House of Lords, you'd think that they would bring some amendments. What happens then if individual migrants take their cases all the way up to the European Court of Human Rights, and then ministers have to make that decision whether to ignore that ruling or go ahead with it? What happens then? And what happens if Rwanda breaks the terms of the treaty? Does the UK ignore that? So there's all of these different stumbling blocks of where they will, have to face the decision of whether they break international law or not, which could mean that flights to Rwanda are yet to take off.
I think the hope is that they can get one plane to take off, and that if there are challenges, they can get the plane to take off first and have migrants then challenge it in Strasbourg afterwards, and then they can kind of have that argument with the ECHR once the plane has taken off. The sort of symbolism of this plane, even though it's only got one person on it, taking off has kind of become central to the Tory identity, but also to the sort of Tory hopes of possibly winning the next election. Now, none of the polls show that is likely, that this wouldn't do enough to be able to move the polls. And also that while migration is a really salient issue for Conservative voters, it's not a salient issue for swing voters or Labour voters, who are much more interested in the cost of living crisis and the NHS. So it's one of those things where even if they could get the plane to take off, there's no guarantee it would save them the election. But I think in the sort of Tory psyche, it's become this thing. One plane, that is all they need, and that will somehow save them.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it was interesting watching Rishi Sunak's press conference.
Yeah, so he did a press conference to sort of defend or announce these measures.
Which was interesting. I mean, he came out with such a... I mean, if you're being complimentary, you'd call it like this verve, this energy, but I think it dipped into anger, and he looked very irritable, and people keep using the word tetchy, which is interesting because I think he feels like his premiership and his reputation and his ability to lead the party is dependent on this succeeding.
Are you saying to your MPs bluntly on all of this, back me or sack me?
What I'm saying, not just to my MPs, but to the entire country, is that I share their frustration. Right. My patience with this has worn thin.
They have gone all in on this issue, which is interesting. When you think back to the autumn statement when we were seeing some dividing lines being made with Labour on tax, on fiscal conservatism, on how you grow the economy. Is it investment or is it through tax cuts? So those were some of the dividing lines that we had, and it feels as if they've jettisoned those in favour of the migration issue on both legal and illegal, which is highly risky because on both of them, as we discussed, it's highly likely that they might fail.
Yeah, and there's been a bit of more exposure of his sort of perhaps his ineptitude at politics, hasn't there? Because he and Robert Jenrick were quite close. I remember they did that op-ed along with Oliver Dowden endorsing Boris Johnson. And Robert Jenrick sort of, he backed Sunak in both of those leadership campaigns when a lot of Conservative MPs who weren't that keen on Liz Truss were moving across to support Liz Truss. He stuck with him. And the calculation was, let's put Jenrick in the Home Office to try and temper Suella Braverman, which, Tory Prime Ministers have done in the past similar things. I think Damien Green was put in on the immigration brief to try and be that one nation voice in that department. And it clearly hasn't worked out. Maybe Jenrick has felt very frustrated by the blocks within the Home Office or, within the court system to these measures that they want to bring across. But also perhaps he feels slighted that he didn't get promoted for his loyalty. Is that a misstep from Rishi Sunak as well in terms of just, being a political operator?
Yeah, so I think the reshuffle hasn't played out well for him. Bringing Cameron in, there were arguments for that, and I think quite a lot of MPs are quite pleased about that. But the rest of the reshuffle, that was kind of his opportunity to clear out anyone that he hadn't chosen himself and just stick a whole load of allies in, which he didn't get the chance to do taking over from Liz Truss. That's what he did. And it's a really delicate balancing act with the reshuffle, because you do want to be surrounded by allies, but you also have to give enough to your opponents or your possible rivals that they feel seen and heard and valued. And he didn't do that, and I think Jenrick...
Well, he did with Braverman, and I mean, there's a lot of examples of how many of these things that we all sort of were stroking our chins about and saying was very wise when he put his cabinet together actually haven't worked out that well.
I think getting rid of Braverman, you could have done that, but bringing somebody else in at a lower cabinet position to still say, there's some voice here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's why we had the appointment of Esther McVey late in the day.
But Minister for Common Sense, it's not enough.
No.
And I do think Jenrick was angling for more of a promotion and was disappointed that he didn't get one. I also think you've got to see it in the context of the shadow leadership contest that is going on with all of these Conservatives. They forget Rishi Sunak, they're looking ahead. What are they going to need if they want to have a stab at it? Robert Jenrick is one of the ones who might quite like a go, and I think has made a calculation that being very tough on immigration is a way to make yourself palatable to the right of the party while still enjoying the support of the kind of more common sense moderate. So I think it's a tactical position as well, probably, of being quite fed up.
Yeah, and most ministers who go into the Home Office end up,
Never
being Home Office, right?
Under
Labour,
it tends to affect your psyche.
He was the one who wanted to paint. He painted over these not personally, but the murals in the Kent facility for child migrants.
Robert Jenrick holding a paintbrush.
Well, he'll have plenty more time to paint some walls now.
I mean, I think the key thing for Rishi Sunak at the moment is that even if he does get some flights off, the fact that his party is now so divided, the fact that his MPs are already thinking about the next election, means that he's not going to be able to coherently communicate anything to the public in the lead up to the next election. No. You can't have a successful policy and then also not have a successful communication of it. The two go hand in hand, and they're completely off message. They're not really focused on the issue. Robert Jenrick, I think you're right, because of what we were saying about what the Rwanda government has said. It's not really a genuine reason to resign, I don't think. So therefore, it clearly is a play, a ploy, a move towards the right. it makes it extremely difficult for Rishi Sunak, and you can see his frustration in that press conference. He obviously thinks that he's doing the best that he can, and he's frustrated that perhaps he thinks his party has already moved on.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.